Welcome back, everyone. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is the third installment of the Knoxville Public Library's Voter Education Series, which is being hosted and taught by Melissa Molloy. Melissa is a graduate from Knoxville High School and a more recent graduate of Reed College in Oregon. While there, she studied international and comparative policy studies. We're lucky to have her around for a while before she moves on to law school, where she plans on focusing her studies on election or employment law. This series helps her further her goal of encouraging voter participation in her community and beyond. Of course, part of the voting process is becoming informed on the topics and the candidates. Tonight's class is aimed at helping us sort through the overwhelming amount of information that's out there. You may be struggling with questions like, how can I find out what the candidates really believe, or what they've really done, or what they've really said? How do I know what news media to trust? How can I be my own fact checker? Melissa has a plan for us, and so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Heather, thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction, as always. So like she said, tonight's class is about news literacy and responsible voting. I'm so excited to talk about this topic with you. I have been interested in news literacy and identifying, what real news is ever since I attended a conference sponsored, or my participation of which was sponsored by the Knoxville Public Library in 2012, I believe it was. So for the last 8 years, I've been, learning how to, identify media as, honest or not, and I'm excited to share that knowledge with you. Just a couple things before I get started here. So I have some questions, or I have saved some time for questions at the end of the presentation. Obviously, there are so many things that I'm not going to be able to cover in a 1-hour presentation tonight. The landscape of media is always changing. There are things that I just don't have time to delve into right now, like how to trust if a poll or how to understand poll data and whether or not it's trustworthy or representative, what deep fakes are and why they're an emerging problem, and so many other things along those lines. I can tell you my knowledge about them if you have, specific questions, and you can feel free to ask those during the question time. At any point, if you run into a question, please go ahead and send it to the chat, and I'll be addressing those questions at the end. So without further ado, just a little roadmap of my presentation here tonight. So we're going to start with just a little warm-up question to get your mind thinking about, news and media consumption. Then we're going to move into the presentation, which should last probably about 30 minutes, and then after that is my time for questions. So here we go. So one more question for you is I want you to think about, what is your primary source for news updates? On a daily basis, when you're looking for information, where is the first place you go for news? Alternatively, if you consume news passively, where are you most likely to encounter news? So when you're thinking about that, here is some data from 2016 about nationwide news sources. So as you can see here, about 4 in 10 Americans often get their news online. That obviously has increased so much in many of our lifetimes. It did not used to be a really important form of news, but for a lot of us now it is. We still very frequently get our news from television, but increasingly, it comes from online. Not just from online, like newspaper websites, but also from our social media, from websites and everything along those lines. You also notice that younger folks are more likely to get their news online, and people who are older are more likely to get it from TV or print newspapers because that's what they grew up with. So with that in mind as well, this is a list of the specific sites, social media pathways where people get their news. So as you can see here, Facebook is by and large the place where the most people get their online news. 43% of adults who responded to this survey use Facebook to get some of their news. Now, this isn't necessarily their exclusive news source. It's just a place that they do get it while they're spending time online. Coming in second, we've got YouTube at 21%. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Reddit pages, Snapchat, WhatsApp, and Tumblr are also options for where people get their news. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is from 2018. And then with that in mind, this graph right here, it's from a Forbes study in 2018, I believe, that talks about where people get their news that is false news, or untrustworthy websites. You can see here that from the 4 kind of sites that they looked at, Facebook was most likely to be the source of traffic to untrustworthy sites. So how this looked at, traffic to untrustworthy websites, hard news, and then, websites that were neither of those things. And it asked, the data where or how they got to that news site. And Facebook was approximately 16%, the source of traffic to untrustworthy news sites. And if you'll remember, if 43% of us are getting our news from Facebook in some capacity, we're much more likely to encounter untrustworthy news, which is why learning news literacy skills is so important moving forward. Okay, and then just a quick, a little bit more. People do largely understand that their information that they get online is going to be largely inaccurate. On this graph here on the left from the Pew Research Center, you can see 50% of people who responded to the survey believe that the information that they're getting online is largely inaccurate. And then, also some information there about, where we get our news on social media. This is a little more updated. This is from 2018 as opposed to 2016. And then here, the green graph you can see is Americans' trust in mass media. So specifically newspapers, TV, and radio from the last several decades. And you can see that it has decreased over time, and it hit an all-time low at 32% in the 2016 elections, or in 2016, largely regarding elections. So with all that data in mind, by the end of this class, you will be able to confidently identify the categories of informational media, recognize spin, slant, and other forms of media bias, and most importantly, know what to do when you encounter biased or untruthful media. Okay. So first things first, we're going to talk about identifying forms of media, because what you think might be news might not be news. And all of this information in this section, and in fact, a lot of the sections in my presentation, is adapted from the News Literacy Project. Just a little plug for NLP. It is a fantastic resource, both for teachers who are looking to teach news literacy skills to their students, and also for the general public. They recently released essentially all of their online resources for public use. They used to be exclusive to classrooms, but now anyone can have access to them, which I think is incredibly important. They have everything from little blurbs about, what slant is, to whole posts about, different forms of media, which I'm about to go into. And they also have great things like games that you can use to play to teach yourself how to how to identify, bias in media and stuff like that. So absolutely check out the News Literacy Project. I love them so much, and I follow them on social media. So news or not, let's talk about knowing the difference. So where are the types, or what are the types of information that you can encounter on a regular basis? First, obviously, we have news. News informs you through objective reporting about local, national, and international events, issues, and people of significance or of interest. So news, it's exactly what we expect it to be. It's straightforward. It's telling you what's going on, the who, what, when, where of what happened. You also can encounter opinion pieces. Opinion pieces can sometimes be similar to news, but they have a purpose other than strict information. They're looking to persuade you, ideally through the use of fact-based evidence, to adopt a specific point of view about an issue or event. I'm sure all of us were supposed to write a persuasive essay in high school. This is kind of like that, except on a much bigger scale. Opinion pieces should be designated as such. Proper news source will always identify an opinion piece as being as an opinion piece, so that you're not being misled to think that this is objective news, but rather that it has a goal of persuading you. Advertising, obviously, it's meant to sell you a product or service. The point behind any advertisement is to get you to buy something. So keep that in mind whenever you encounter an advertisement, that they're going to be likely to probably exaggerate the effectiveness of their product or service, or potentially tell you about how bad that thing is that you want to avoid, all of that kind of thing. They want your money, so they're going to tell you what they think you need to hear in order to, get you to purchase it. Entertainment, the purpose of entertainment is to amuse, please, relax, or distract you. We love being entertained. Entertainment is a good thing. You know, I'm not trying to say that it's a bad thing at all by not including it in news, but it has a specific purpose, and that's, you know, to entertain us. Okay. Propaganda is another form of information. Propaganda provokes you, often by using false or distorted information to manipulate your emotions. And I want to quickly make an aside. Propaganda and often, you know, other things like opinion, advertising, and entertainment do try and pass themselves off as news. That's a dishonest tactic, but part of this whole presentation is that you can learn to identify what's not really news from among the things that are purporting to be news. And finally, we do have raw information. Raw information documents an event or trend. It has not been analyzed, checked, edited, explained, or placed in any context. So for instance, a raw information that would just be, you know, like security cam footage that, you know, isn't explained, you know, like, why is it there? We don't know yet. It's raw. And so that is something that you may encounter. And whenever you do encounter it, if it hasn't been, you know, processed in any way, I would say to, you know, be a little critical. Raw information is always best because, you know, context really can help us understand why things are occurring. But I'll get into all that in a little bit. So those are your types of information, but I also want to talk about where information comes from. We have a lot of sources of information in the world today, and it's not always from the places that you'd expect, even though some of the things that you do expect, obviously, are newspapers and magazines. A lot of Americans do get their information from newspapers and magazines, you know, either online or in print. It's tried and true, good oldie. We also have television and radio. We all are, we might not all, but a lot of us watch the nightly news, or we get, you know, a daily email with, you know, the news, or we might flip on the radio on our way to work and catch part of a news story. We can also get our information from online articles, fact check websites, or static pages. So this isn't necessarily, you know, the online site for a newspaper, but it could be articles, opinion pieces, blogs, like I said, fact check websites, and I'm going to talk so much more about fact checking later because I love it, as well as static pages. You know, for instance, we can get information from like a college website, or, you know, the web page for a business or anything like that. That is a source of information. And social media posts. Increasingly, we are getting so much of our information from social media. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you know, TikTok, online forums like Reddit. These are all places where we get our information, and we might be initially more distrustful of this information. You remember 57% of people you know, expected information from social media to be less trustworthy. However, we are still encountering it frequently, and even if we're aware that it might not be trustworthy, the act of encountering it will influence, you know, our perceptions and our understanding of things. So that's something to be aware of. And additionally, word of mouth. We all talk to other people, maybe less so now that we're all in quarantine, but, you know, we talk to folks in person and online, and we get a lot of our information about the world, and also a lot of our processes for understanding the world around us from the people around us, especially the people that we care about. And it is important to remember that people are people, and just because someone said it to you in person doesn't necessarily make it any more true than if you read it online. So now I want to move on to identifying bias in media. And so this specific section is adapted from a site called All Sides. All Sides is also a great organization. They specifically are a multi-partisan, so not necessarily nonpartisan, but a multi-partisan website that's dedicated to helping people identify you know, bias in news sources. Specifically, they keep a running list based on crowdsourced perceptions of forms of media to identify whether media is consistently, you know, far left, lean left, moderate, you know, lean right, or far right. And then a little disclaimer on that. All Sides does be very specific that something, you know, being far right or far left or lean left or lean right does not necessarily make it bad. It just means that you should take that information into account when you're encountering, information from that. And similarly, a rating of neutrality does not necessarily mean that it is good information. It's once again just something that you have in your arsenal to understand how the information is being presented to you may be skewed, slanted, biased in any way. And I'm going to talk about specifically the kind of bias that you can identify in these next couple slides. So first off, what is bias? What a good question. So something is biased when it strays from the straightforward reporting of objective fact. So, straightforward reporting of objective fact, it literally just says, who was there, what happened, when did it happen, and, basic information like that. It doesn't try and tell you whether something that happened is good or bad. It doesn't try to influence your perception by using things like loaded language. It just tells you what happened. Now, bias, I do want to say it is not inherently bad. Every single person on this planet has bias. It's part of being human. But the problem is when unadmitted bias is passed off as objective reporting because it shapes our views without our knowing. So, like I said, bias is real, it's okay, everyone has it, but hidden bias or a bias that is pretending not to be bias is where, the problems come in. And some bias is obvious and some of it isn't. And forms of bias have significant overlap. You can see on my little iceberg over here, I have, obvious bias for things like verbal attacks or sensationalism, and then the deeper we go down, the more hidden it becomes. That is not me saying that some of these forms of bias are more dangerous or worse or any way. I'm strictly looking at this in a how easy it is generally to spot. But some of it, the dangerousness of it or how strongly it can influence you is not necessarily based on how easy it is to spot. And then, like I said, many of these types of bias are similar and they do have overlap. It's what's not important is you don't have to be able to say that's slant or that's spin or that's an unsubstantiated claim with the force of being like, I know exactly what that is. What's more important is that you get a sense, a compass in a way of identifying there's not something that's quite right here and I need to research further. So a note on my examples here. In the following slides, I use real examples of bias from online news sources reporting on the topic of voter fraud. So I'm keeping it contained in this one topic that is election related. And these are, sources that I found in preparing this presentation. I would literally just Google like voter fraud and then look up, pieces on that. And I did use all sides to direct my search to specific news sites. So I looked very frequently at far right or far left or lean left or lean right news sources to find my examples of bias. And then the sources, unless otherwise noted, are claiming to be reporting news as described in the previous slides, even though, as we'll see, they're probably more leaning towards an unmarked opinion piece or even propaganda. So keep that in mind. All of these things are, purporting to be news, and it's important for all of us to understand that just because it says it's news or we think that it's news, that it might not necessarily be straightforward reporting. And I do try to balance examples from news sources on the left and the right of the political spectrum, just to show that it is a problem everywhere, even though, some sites are obviously worse than others. And that's kind of, something for you to look up on your own time and always be aware of. Okay. So first, I do want to talk a little bit about the different forms of obvious bias. So mudslinging and ad hominem attacks, those are so obviously someone's opinion or an insult. So it's unfair or insulting things are said about someone in order to damage their reputation or credibility. It is attacks on a person's motive or character traits instead of the content of their argument or idea. So what's bad about these things is that it's conflating the person and their motive or character traits with the idea that's being reported on. So it's not separating the straightforward facts, and it's making unfair statements regarding that. So my example for this, you'll see in this article from the National Sentinel, it says, and most of the time when all is said and done, we find that it's President Trump who is right, and the perfumed, blow-dried, shellacked princes and princesses of the MSM who are wrong. So MSM is mainstream media here, and it's completely unnecessary to refer to reporters in the mainstream media as perfumed, blow-dried, and shellacked princes and princesses, and it does nothing to further the factual, your purpose of this piece, to use that. It's specifically being used to attack those people and to make you trust them less. So that's obviously very apparent when you see that kind of, mudslinging ad hominem attacks. You can also see things like sensationalism or emotionalism as a form of obvious bias. A note on this, it's not always obvious. Sometimes they hide it really well, and it can be accomplished through different means, but the example that I have here of sensationalism/emotionalism is pretty obvious. So the information in this is presented in a way that gives a shock or makes a deep impression. The whole point of it is shock value or to make you get angry. It's often vague yet dramatic, and it warps reality to mislead or provoke a strong reaction in the reader. So here I have Des Moines newspaper slams Iowa GOP's egregious voter suppression campaign in a scathing editorial, and it also refers to the sleazy voter suppression campaign that the GOP has been waging, and the blistering editorial that was published about it. So you can see this language here is really strong. The language itself here used on alternate, the language itself, it's telling you how you should feel about this. It's not, it's not saying like a report was published by the Des Moines Register or their editorial bar that, says that there might be a problem with voter suppression within the GOP. It's telling you without telling you that, you should have their very specific opinions, and that's a sensationalism and emotionalism approach. So I'm moving on now to a little bit of what I call sneaky bias. It's a mid-range level of bias. It can be hard to detect or it can be easy to detect, but generally I find it to be pretty sneaky. So the first example of this is mind reading. The source assumes that they know what another person thinks or wants or their motives, and the source thinks that the way that they see the world reflects the way the world really is. So my example here, I will note that this is designated as an opinion piece, but this is still one of the best examples that I could find of mind reading. So I did include it anyway, and you'll find this in opinion pieces, in pieces that are supposed to be news or propaganda. That's not the important part. The important part is that you're able to recognize it and then consider how it might affect your interpretation. So here we have Republicans across the nation are trying to stop eligible voters from voting. They are, in short, attacking our democracy for their political gain. So this is USA Today opinion. There's no really reason that Abe would specifically know exactly what Republicans are trying to do with, voter identification laws, strict voter registration laws and stuff like that. It is his opinion that that's what these people are doing, but saying that he knows that that's exactly why Republicans are doing what they're doing is mind reading. Heavy air quotes, obviously. He's interpreting their actions based on how he sees the world. So then we have the problem of opinions stated as fact. So this is subjective language or statements that are under the guise of reporting objectively. This, as a little note, it could be an objective fact that's followed by a subjective statement, but the subjectivity of the statement that follows might not be as obvious, and it might be conflated with that fact that's stated so that you think that that's also true. So here we have a quote from President Trump where he says, now mail ballots, they cheat. Okay, people cheat. Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters. They go and collect them. They're fraudulent in many cases. You got to vote, and they should have voter ID, by the way. If you want to do it right, you have voter ID. So obviously, these things are the president's opinions. They're not being backed up with facts here. He's making this claim that mail ballots are dangerous and that voter ID is the thing that's correct. He's not saying that, in my opinion, we should have voter ID for these reasons. He's not saying that in my experience, mail-in ballots have felt insecure. He's saying these things as if they are facts. And that is what opinion stated as fact is. Okay, and so flawed logic is also a sneaky form of bias. This one is really hard to nail down, especially when considering your own logic, because we all have a world view, and especially if things seem to match up with our perception of the world, it's really hard to identify this sometimes. But flawed logic is jumping to conclusions or arriving at a conclusion that doesn't follow from the premise. So it's like, if you have A and B, you immediately jump to T. All of those parts in the middle, they're not there, and they need to be there. And they also may misrepresent people's opinions or actions to arrive at conclusions that are not justified by the given evidence. So here we have some Twitter, or a thread on Twitter. So President Trump said, rigged 2020 election, millions of mail-in ballots will be printed by foreign countries and others. It will be the scandal of our times. And then H. Krasentine replied, this tweet serves two purposes. It makes his base weary of election results, and it's a direct request to China and Russia to print out and send fake mail-in ballots in order to create a scandal surrounding his election loss. He'll then claim he predicted this. So both of these tweets are presenting flawed logic. There is absolutely no evidence, and in fact evidence to the contrary, to say that mail-in ballots would be printed by foreign countries and sent to the US, or even that there are significant rates of mail-in ballot fraud at all. And so by saying it's going to be the scandal of our times is absolutely a jumped to conclusion, a flawed logic, a misrepresentation. And then similarly, the response, H. Krassenstein has no idea whether the original tweet is inviting foreign countries to print out and send fake mail-in ballots in order to create a scandal. So that once again, A, B jumping all the way down to T, it's flawed logic. Okay, so now we have slant. Slant is a super fun form of bias where you cherry pick information or data to support one side while ignoring another perspective. And what slant does is it prevents readers from getting the full story, and it narrows our scope of understanding. So for me, it looks like, if you squint at it and you turn your head, you slant your head a little bit. That's kind of how I see what slanting is. But so here we have a 2020 article from the National Sentinel, the title of which, in 2005, panel co-chaired by Jimmy Carter found absentee ballots remained the largest source of potential voter fraud. So just from this headline alone, you'd be like, okay, wow, I should be really worried about absentee ballots. And this panel sounds real legit, and I should believe what they're saying. But then I find here from factcheck.org, actually, you can see that here we have slant in that the total number of cases was just 499 of absentee ballot fraud. Between 2000 and 2012, during which a period in which literally billions of votes are cast. So while it is true that absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud, what the National Sentinel failed to state is that it's literally less than like 0.0000001% voter mail-in fraud rate. And so that is slanting our perspective and narrowing the scope of our understanding to conceiving of this as a problem. And similarly, this is another kind of bias that I just could not pass up right now. The panel co-chaired by Jimmy Carter is never brought up in the article at all. The article does not source it, it does not discuss it, it just brings it up in the title and then forgets about it entirely, and instead, discusses isolated incidents of mail-in fraud without ever referencing that study again. And I had a very, very difficult time finding the study at all online. So now we got spin. Spin and slant are very similar. I'm not gonna lie to you on that. But spin, it strays from objective and measurable facts. It uses things like loaded language, which is vague, dramatic, or sensational. So you might remember from earlier where you had words like slammed and egregious, and words that are telling you how to think. And what spin does is it clouds a reader's view and prevents them from getting a precise take on what happened. So here from Forbes, we have that Jim Raffensperger took aim, that Jordan Fuchs blamed, that CEO Michael Furman slammed, all of these words, they're dramatizing it. A lot of news and media is saying things that are going to get you clicks, that are going to get you views, that are going to get you money. And so there is a direct incentive to playing up the importance of the drama, or the drama of things, so that you can get that. And what it does is sometimes it makes things seem larger and more important than they really are. So in this instance, the word "said" could have just been used 8 times and it would have been totally fine. So that's kind of what spin is. It puts a spin on what happened. So sneaky bias. Sneaky bias relies on what is not there. So my first form of sneaky bias here is omission of source attribution. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's when the sources of information go unidentified. This doesn't necessarily make those statements false, but it does make them less reliable. So the examples that I have here are a Washington Times article. Several research organizations have dived deep into the justice and fairness win-loss record in voting rights cases, and then liberal groups have a long list, and conservatives say. This is a problem in several ways. So first, it does not name the several research organizations, it does not name the liberal groups, and it does not name the conservatives, and further, it talks for entire groups. So this is not to say that every single liberal group has a long list of what they say are voter suppression methods, and it doesn't say that every single conservative, and it is saying that every conservative, says that voter suppression is a myth, and that overstates the idea, of this polarization, in many ways, and that is a problem because it simplifies a very complex problem. It tells you. It's essentially telling you, if you're a liberal, you need to think this, and if you're a conservative, you need to think this. And then these research organizations whose credibility is not discussed or established, whose names are not given, whose studies are not shown, it lends the author a sense of authority when they can toss research organizations or research papers around, even though they don't provide the sources to back up their claims. We also have the problem of unsubstantiated claims. So this is making claims without including evidence to back them up. They appear to be fact, but they do not include specific evidence, and they may have some basis in reality, or they may be completely made up. So unsubstantiated claims are yet another form of media bias. They can be super obvious, or they can be super sneaky or hidden. It's just a matter of learning to recognize when someone is saying something and they don't have the evidence to back them up. So for my examples here, Lou Dobbs back in 2018 said, "We are watching, millions of illegal immigrants cross our borders, and many of them voting in the past election." That's just a couple weeks ago, and having immense impact. So the claims being made in this one sentence are that millions of illegal immigrants cross our borders, that many of them are voting in past elections, and that they are having an immense impact. Throughout this whole interview, there is absolutely no evidence presented about the factuality of these claims. There have been several studies that I'm happy to link if you're interested, showing that, voting by, undocumented or even lawful permanent resident Americans is essentially non-existent, and definitely not enough to sway any election, and especially not people coming to the United States specifically to vote illegally in elections and, somehow take over our democracy. It's just not the case, but that's exactly what Lou Dobbs is saying here, through his words and his unsubstantiated claims. So that's something to be aware of. Once again, this is a super obvious example. It's really easy to come across unsubstantiated claims that make sense to you, and they contribute to confirming, biases that you already have. So be aware whenever someone makes a claim, it should be followed up with evidence, or you should be skeptical of it, even if you already agree with it. Okay. So then we have the problem of bias by omission. This is very similar to, unsubstantiated claims, or whatever the other one was, bias by no source attribution. That's it. So bias by omission, it leaves out information or stories that may support an alternative viewpoint. So this one is very, very similar to slant. It selectively picks the information that you want, but it can be hard to see because of what is not there. So for instance, if something terrible happened and nobody reported about it, that's bias by omission because you never learned about it. So specifically, you'll see that some news sources they get very upset. They're like, why isn't anyone talking about this? This is a huge problem. But they fail to report on other things, and by the converse, there might be some news sources that are reporting on hard-hitting things, and they're doing all this responsible journalism, but those stories are just not being picked up by major news sources because they're not considered important enough. But so here, as far as an example, I have a database from like the Heritage Foundation. So the Heritage Foundation, the whole purpose of it is to document voter fraud across the country. They've been working on this since 2000. And so, they have their numbers here, very terrifying, 1,088 proven instances of voter fraud between 2000 and 2012, I believe. Yes, and then so the article it came from was that database swells to 1285 as of 2020. And then when you see that, you're like, that's a lot. I am so worried about voter fraud now. But when you think about it, I did some little numbers for you here. More than 1 billion votes have been cast since 2000. That's some important context there, because when you look at that, that is 0.0001088% of votes being fraudulent. So, and even if you say that only 1% of voter fraud cases, were brought, in trial and proven, making, actual fraudulent cases about 100,000 instead of 1,000, that's still 0.01% fraud, and that's really not enough to sway any election. There have been, I think, like less than 100 elections in the entirety of U.S. election history have been decided on a margin of less than 0.07%. So, once again, 136,669,276 votes were cast in 2016 alone. If you say that all 100,000 of those theoretical fake votes were cast in that election alone, that's 0.7 of votes. Once again, less than 100 elections have ever been decided by a margin of less than that, and the margin of difference in the popular vote was almost 3 million votes. Once again, that 100,000 pales in comparison. So bias by omission in this case, it's hard to see because it's what they're not saying, which is why it's important to employ some of the tactics that I'm going to discuss in a little bit about how to ensure that the information you're getting is a complete contextualized picture of what's going on. But bias by omission, I consider it a hidden bias very frequently, because it can be telling you something, it can be yelling at you about how bad something is, but if they conveniently forget to contextualize it, then it's absolutely influencing the way that you are interpreting something as a problem or an event. So similarly, as a hidden bias, we have bias by placement. So this one is, if you've ever heard of, a story making it above the fold, being like front page news, all that stuff, that's bias by placement. It's the news source prioritizing what they see as important by making it the most obvious or the most immediate to viewers and readers. So I have the little tab things from the top of a couple of websites. So we've got the National Sentinel, we've got Alternate, and we've got another website that I honestly don't remember exactly what it was, but so you'll see each of them has very different, hot topics. Like COVID, riots and looting, Trump 2020 landslide crisis reports versus immigration, Trump, the religious right, #MeToo, police brutality, BLM, COVID, 2020 election, climate crisis, immigration, Iran, Iraq, freedom of the press, Brazil. All that stuff, they're prioritizing. Those news sources are telling you what they think is important. And if you're not realizing that that information is being selectively chosen, you might also take it as a fact that those things are the things that should be considered important. So, and then just a couple more of those as far as, what stories are the top of the webpage or above the fold. So that's, the different things that each news source, once again, considers important and the things that you pay attention to. Okay, so that kind of brings me to the end of the specific kinds of media bias. However, there are some complications and clarifications that I do want to spend some time discussing. because this isn't all super straightforward. So first things first, good and bad journalistic techniques can and do exist in different pieces of media. You shouldn't see one example of bad journalistic technique and throw out the whole thing as a bad piece. What you need to do is understand that that exists and ask yourself how that might be influencing your perspective on the issue, and what the motive behind all that may be. Bias obviously exists outside news context as well. Personal bias in conversation, in which textbooks and topics are being taught in school, the different things that you see on social media, the things that are being advertised to you, all of that is in a way a product of bias. And once you become more aware of that, once again, it isn't always a bad thing. Just an awareness of it can really help you think more critically about the information that you are encountering on a daily basis. And objectivity and subjectivity are not the same as true or false. So just because something is objective doesn't mean it's good, and just because something is subjective does not make it bad. And similarly, once again, it's not true and it's not false. So just a little thing from butte.edu. Let me go ahead and just read this for you, because I want to get it right. Since objectivity does not guarantee truth, and since subjectivity is not necessarily false, it makes sense that objectivity is not the exact opposite of subjectivity. Subjectivity and objectivity are different ways of knowing. Since subjectivity is a different way of knowing, it is important to participate respectfully in dialogue with those whose subjective claims differ from one's own. It is impossible to respect the person even while it is possible, not impossible, to respect the person even while disagreeing with that person's opinion. As Voltaire said, I may disagree with what you said, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So the belief that every person is entitled to an opinion does not mean that every opinion, on the other hand, is as good as any other. So while objectivity and subjectivity, true and false, those things are not necessarily good or bad, and they're not necessarily opposites. As far as opinions go, not all opinions are equally valuable on all subjects. Some opinions are better informed, more practical, or more compassionate, and better for the human race in general, you might say. Defective opinions and judgments based on defective facts or defective reasoning may be worse than foolish or impractical. They may be harmful. Witness the Holocaust, a result of virulent racist opinions put into action. Cultivate the ability to distinguish objective from subjective. It is crucial to the critical evaluation of claims, intellectual honesty, and respectful dialogue. So I cannot stress this enough. Objectivity and subjectivity, opinion and fact, these things, they all are a huge mess, and we need to wade our way through on a case-by-case basis. So as far as opinion goes, as a general rule, prioritize experience and impact. So if you're talking about the importance of forest management and climate change management when it comes to people whose houses were burned down in a forest fire versus people who are living way up north and have never seen a forest fire, those two opinions are not going to be the same because they have not been equally impacted. Similarly, if you're reposting statements by people who have no expertise on a subject because they agree with you versus someone who has a PhD on the subject, if you're not reposting the things that they say, that's not necessarily good information spreading, because their experience and their knowledge is more appropriate than that person who happens to be agreeing with what you're saying. And once again, I want to emphasize that neutrality is not always correct. Sometimes it is just the case that there aren't two sides to every story, which I think might actually be my next one. Yes, sometimes there just aren't two sides to every story. Sometimes it means that there are more sides to every story, and sometimes it just means that making like one person says this but another person disagrees is doing a disservice to the public. So for instance, with climate change, oftentimes it's presented as one scientist who thinks that it exists and another scientist that thinks that it doesn't exist, when in fact it would be more accurate to have like 999 scientists on a panel that believe that climate change is serious and we need to do something about it, and then that one little lone guy who says that it's not. Those two things are not equal. Those scientific opinions are not equal, and there are not two sides to that story. It can also be the case that if you're interviewing someone whose house is burning down or whose house had a tree fall on it, and you interview that person whose house is wrecked, and then someone who lived next to them, the person who lived next to them said trees fall all the time. Like, why are we so worried about this tree? It's not a huge issue. And the other person is like, a tree fell on my house. Like, I've lost everything. Those two things are not equal. You know, they might be, you know, absolutely true facts. The trees do fall all the time. They don't always wreck houses. Yes, but that specific house was wrecked. And we need to be, you know, cognizant of that kind of thing. And then just the idea of the intention and the impact of journalistic reporting. So sometimes a journalist might really have the best intentions in mind. They might be trying their best to do, you know, things the right way, and they could still cause bad, they might still cause harm. And that's not to say that, you know, all the journalists should hang up their hats if they ever make a mistake. But, you know, you should be aware that that's a thing that happens, and just because someone didn't intend to do something badly doesn't mean that they did not do it badly in the first place. So moving right along now, news literacy in action. Let's practice identifying some bias in media. But first, just a little bit beyond bias, fake news in media, because I'm sure we have all heard about fake news. So fake news is most commonly referred to as journalism or information that either deliberately or intentionally misleads people and distorts reality by spreading false information, hoaxes, propaganda, or misrepresentation of facts. Fake news, propaganda, they're the same thing, they're best friends, whatever. So examples of fake news: false information, misapplied or misrepresented facts, omission of information, misleading choices of what should be considered news. So these look all familiar as kinds of bias that we encountered. It's just that all of these are ramped up. So the danger of fake news. According to a 2018 study of 11 years of Twitter data, fake news can spread 6 times as fast and 100 times as far as verifiable facts do. And so that is a huge problem. If you see something and you're like, oh man, and you hit retweet real fast, and then you encounter the truth later, the chances that you're going to retweet the truth or go back and delete your old post are very low, and that's how misinformation spreads. And then you might be asking, why does fake news spread so fast and so far? It relies on a number of different things. So false news is more likely to be novel, meaning that it contains information that the sharer has not seen before, and it's much more likely to incite emotion of fear, disgust, or surprise and encourage them to share it because it provokes a response. So I did talk a little bit ago about why, you know, you might want to put a spin on a story using that loaded language, make it seem more dramatic than it is. It's for the clicks, it's for the shares, it's for the money, the advertisement dollars, everything like that. And that's why fake news also can spread so far, is because it incites an emotion and it makes you want to do something, even if that something is just, you know, hitting share. And then, you know, people are also obviously subject to something called confirmation bias, which is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's existing beliefs or hypotheses, while giving disproportionately less consideration to alternative possibilities. And the effect of confirmation bias is amplified when strong emotions are brought into it. So if I already believe, for instance, that cats are the best animal in the world, and I see something that says, like, cat saves lives of 40 farmers, then I'm going to share it without maybe looking at the fact that, I don't know, the cat didn't actually do anything. He just sat there and looked cute. That was a weird example, but basically you're more likely to share something if it makes you angry based on what you believe, if it makes you feel, you know, basically any strong emotion based on what you already believe, and you're much more likely to be skeptical of something that you disagree with, whether or not it's true. Oh no. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now identifying honest journalism. So we know what to look for and see that it's bad, but how can we tell if something is a good source of information? You came to the right place. So good information sources contain straightforward, non-sensational language. They tell you the who, the what, the where, you know, the how, all that stuff. It just tells you what's going on and it leaves. It includes specific fact-checkable claims supported by context and evidence. So conspiracy theories, you can't really fact-check them because they're just so broad, or they're so specific, or so weird that there isn't anything specifically to disprove them, but that doesn't make them true. So claims made in a good information source are specific, so they're not broad claims like liberals support this or conservatives support this. They're like, you know, this specific person or this specific group says this, and you can then go fact-check that claim. And they're supported by context and evidence. So once again, statements are couched in context, so you're not running into the problem of seeing a tiny, tiny little thing and missing all the stuff around the outside. A good information source will disclose potential bias, and they will designate information pieces. Like I said, every single person on this planet has bias, and it's a responsible journalism tactic to disclose potential bias that you have. And once again, that bias might not be a bad thing, but it's still a good thing to recognize. So good information sources, when you're seeking out information, especially about news, you should prioritize on-the-ground reporting over talking head commentators. So you might love the opinions of, your favorite, news commentators, but as far as seeking information on, an event itself, definitely prioritize on-the-ground reporting, by which I mean the people who went out there, they reported on it, they asked the questions, they sought, the answers, and then, obviously it's still okay to, watch those talking heads, but, you might consider including some of that under the ground reporting before you get your opinions from them. And a good information source will always reach out to the subjects that they're reporting. So they'll reach out for comment, or, that they attempted to contact the person that they're reporting on. So, like the paparazzi, and all of those, entertainment magazines that just have these wild claims, obviously, they're not reaching out to the celebrities for comment on whether or not, like, they're dying of cancer. So that is not a good information source about whether that celebrity is actually dying of cancer. And something that's really important is a good information source will make a clear, loud, and quick correction of their mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Everybody has those days. And so a good information source will take accountability for the things that they said wrong, and they will make corrections. A bad news source will say something that's untrue and move on, never speak of it again, or they will keep repeating their mistakes louder and louder to try and make them sound like the truth. And that is a huge red flag. Okay, so a little self-check that you can participate in is it really fake news? It's tempting to call things that we don't like fake news. So applying an objective set of standards, like we're on the last slide, help us keep our emotions out of the identification process. So we can see something that we don't like and still apply those and be like, okay, maybe this is something real and that I should learn more about. And so if the only standard that you're looking for is it agrees with me, then you aren't looking for real news. And that's basically like my check for is it fake news, or am I just angry about it because I don't agree with what's being said? Apply those standards on the last slide. Here's a little piece from the News Literacy Project. It's specifically about COVID-19, but it's 4 quick steps to stop the spread of information. It's really straightforward. First thing to do when you read something, pause. You might be experiencing some strong emotions, but do not let those emotions take over and make you hit that share button. You should glance through the comments, see if someone has replied to this post with a fact check. And if they haven't, do a quick search on your own. In the search bar, Google the thing that you're seeing in the form of a question, or just Google it straightforward and, see what's out there as far as fact checking or other reporting. And then, also ask for the source from the person on the post. Reply to that person asking for the original source or for other evidence that are supporting the claim. And this, doing it in the comment section does raise awareness of whether or not the claim is questionable. And once you follow these steps, if you can find credible evidence that the post isn't true, alert the others in a reply on the comment section. And if the post is dangerous or harmful, like if it's including hateful rhetoric, report it. And if you still aren't sure that the post is true even after all that, just don't share it. It's so much better to leave a post unshared, even if it is true, than it is to share something that's false, especially when it comes to things that could impact people's lives. So real quickly, I want to talk about reputable fact check websites. My hot tip for this is follow fact checking sources on social media. It really changes the way I encounter media, because if I see something, the first thing I might see about it is a fact check. So I might know that this false claim is going around, and if I encounter it, I already know that it's not true. So Snopes is not politics specific. PolitiFact is politics specific, and then factcheck.org is not necessarily politics specific, but it monitors the factual accuracy of statements made by political players in, like ads, speeches, interviews, everything like that. So definitely check out all those great sources. So on a checklist for you for responsible media engagement, I want you to be able to read like every single one of these. I seek news from a variety of reputable sources. I can identify forms of media bias. I notice when reporting, advertising, and viral posts are manipulating my emotions. I know how to fact check claims before I share them and to inform others of false claims they have shared. I recognize and admit my own biases and how they affect my patterns of media consumption. And I participate in lateral reading to verify information as I go. So earlier I talked about bias by omission. A way that you can avoid that is with something called lateral reading. And literally what that is while you're reading something, open another tab and find other sources that fact check or otherwise discuss the claims being made within that article. So you're not reading vertically, which is, from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. You're reading laterally. You read something down, or you read a while down, you get a statement, you Google that statement, you learn about it, you go back, all that stuff. It helps you more responsibly engage with media. So if you're looking for further research and further learning on news literacy, as I know I always am, I took a lot of my information today from the News Literacy Project in All Sides. Super, super, super great resources. Definitely read up on them. Obviously make your own opinions. And then if you're interested in practicing how to identify fake news and bias, Factitious is an app by Jolt and AU Game Lab. You can identify different kinds of media bias, and then Real or Fake by PunditFact/PolitiFact. Once again, practicing. You can keep yourself up to date on the battle for internet accountability with the Tech Transparency Project. I follow them on Twitter. They give me lots of updates on things that I didn't even know were happening, as far as, the battle for both keeping your own data safe and, holding companies accountable for the information that they're spreading, all the stuff like that. And it just in general encourage news literacy education in schools, either by, if you're a parent, telling your kids' teachers that they should teach more about news literacy, or encouraging your student to learn more about it. So yeah, that's further research, obviously, look into it more. And I did only save a couple minutes for questions. That went longer than I thought it was going to. But yeah, now's the time for questions. Anything that you might want to know, it's that time.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa. I'll give everyone a moment to gather their thoughts. I think the chat is open for people. I don't think anybody's muted. Give it a moment. You might have done it again though, right? Because I'm writing down my questions as you go along. My number one question was, I was hoping you would give us recommendations for good fact checking sites. And I thought that's going to be such an insightful question for me to ask you. And then of course that was one of your big slides, which is great. Okay, I have one question. Oh, here comes a question. It says, what is the best non-biased news station? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that is a really good question to ask, because the answer is that there is no best news station. The most important thing you can do is actively, be critical of the news that you are engaging. Obviously, there are some news sources that are most consistently more neutral in their reporting, and you can visit All Sides to look at a list of those. But even within those, a bunch of different people are on each of those teams, writing those articles. The people who are in charge of directing people what articles to write have their own biases. So I wish that I could say that there was one 100% unbiased news station, but unfortunately that just doesn't exist, because if something wasn't biased, it would mean that it was saying everything about everything all the time, and then you would never be able to actually understand any news, because as humans we are incapable of comprehending everything that's happening in the world at one time. So that's why it's important to get your information from several reputable sources instead of just one news source, because it does, even if you center your information on a particular perspective, even a group of sources from there can help you get a more nuanced perspective of what's going on. So the short answer, there is no best non-biased news station, and you should search out your information from multiple sources.
Would you say that there are 2 or 3 in the industry that have particularly good reputations? Maybe.
So I can,
somebody's like, I want to start making sure that I'm going to more than one site or something like that. Maybe they always go to CNN or they always go to Fox News and they want to expand it. Would there be 2 or 3 that you would recommend that might help them get a better, more balanced view or something like that, that maybe have just really strong reputations within the industry?
Yeah, so for instance, NPR is a really good one. That's National Public Radio. PBS, generally any of your public broadcasting stations are going to be fairly reputable because they don't make money off of it as much as like private news stations and news sources do. So that kind of thing. So NPR, PBS, that kind of stuff. Your most of your or some of your mainstream media is like CNN, NBC, are pretty straightforward as far as their reporting, but they still do fall prey to some sensationalism tactics because they are trying to get people to watch, and so they're also going to report on the most exciting news stories. So yeah, once again, if you are looking for a list of neutral news sources, or if you're looking to expand across the aisle or looking to read more things that already align with your views, all of those are super valid. I would absolutely suggest that you visit All Sides. They have an incredible chart of online news sources based on their most consistent bias ratings, as well as I think they have ranked several hundred online news sources for their consistent bias ratings. So visit All Sides for your online news sources. As far as like TV and radio, I don't have a great source like All Sides for those news sources, but you can, I'm sure that there are other websites out there. If you even just Google bias rating of then whatever news station that you're interested in, you can get an idea of whether they have a consistent bias of any sort.
That actually raises a couple, well, in the comments to what you've been saying, we've got people saying that someone they know says that they watch BBC because it gives a different perspective, and also that PBS NewsHour is generally perceived to be fair. So that aligns with what you're saying, I believe. And then I have one other question. You've mentioned, Googling a number of times, right? So I might want to Google what the general reputation of bias, of a particular place is. But of course, if I'm just Googling a question that I have about, like, how does the station, is it biased or not, right or left? How can I sort through those Google results, right? Because Google itself isn't gonna, just because it's the number one result, how am I going to wade through all those results to figure out, well, what are the reliable sources that Google is bringing to me to sort through? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a super good question because Google is a search engine depending on your privacy settings that will tailor the responses to what it thinks you will find most interesting. So the more time you spend on Google, the more likely it is to tell you what you want to hear. And that's the same way with algorithms on almost any site. It's going to focus on telling you what you want to hear so that you spend more time on that site. So Google should always only be your starting point for finding information. So if you Google something, open multiple tabs. Once you develop an understanding of what news sources are reputable, but it is also a case in which lateral reading is one of the most important things you can do. So like your likelihood of encountering like two sites in a row that have like the same like weird claim are relatively low, especially if you go to like the big news sources like NPR or PBS, there's stuff like that. And if you're on a website and you're like, I don't know about this, I've never seen it before, if it's online, definitely do check All Sides, and that kind of thing. And generally anything you're reading, if you apply the tools for recognizing media bias, it's going to help you a lot in determining overall whether you think that site is something you should trust, as far as is it straightforward news or is it trying to influence my opinion in some way. And I do see a question here about any print sources I suggest as far as news. I'll be honest, I do get a lot of my news sources online. I get my news from social media, which is part of why I'm so passionate about news literacy, because I understand that a lot of things I'm reading, I should be critical of, and I try to actively engage in that kind of thing. But as far as print sources, what a good question. I mean, major newspapers, some of them do have consistent biases, and once again, I wish that I had like a blanket statement or like super straightforward, here's exactly what you should read, but in a way that would be dishonest of me, because telling you what you should read wouldn't be asking you to critically engage with the content that you're receiving, because once again, I'm a human, I have my own biases. In this presentation, I'm sure that even though I tried my best to adequately present, information in its contexts. I might have failed in some ways, and I want you to always, always, always critically engage anything that you're hearing. And if someone is telling you, like, here's your like one answer to all of your news problems, then they're probably trying to sell you that news source. They probably have an ulterior motive. So it's a never-ending task to be an informed reader on this kind of thing.
I'm seeing a suggestion from some of my fellow librarians. We've got a number of magazine and newspaper selections just near where you're sitting, that the Week might be a good option. It presents both sides. We've got a lot. I mean, that could be something that you can do too. You want to take a break from online, is come in and browse through and pull out multiple. Because I know that we do our best to have a wide selection of titles available. Do you find a difference between what's published in print versus what's available online because of the time lag? Are you going to find more in-depth analyses in the magazines that are printed, or can that also all be found online as well?
Yeah, I mean, in general, something that makes it to print is more likely to be thoroughly like fact-checked and peer-reviewed. So if it's like a science magazine where all of the, or, a periodical of academic text, obviously that's going to be deeply peer-reviewed. So the trustworthiness of that is very high. Gossip magazines, pretty low. They write something, every day to sell magazines. There are, just like with websites, there are news source or news magazines that have a clear bias, or they're trying to do something. Like, for instance, right now I'm looking at Dogster. Obviously the whole point of that is to tell you about dogs and sell you dog products. Entertainment, to tell you about what they think you should watch on TV. Car and Driver, it's about cars. Stuff like that, in the sense that interesting. Yeah, so with that, you can also get things that are printed that are wildly inaccurate or dangerous. Some of that is, a way that you can help do that is follow the money as far as printing things. So there is a website, I believe it's called Open Secrets, where it tracks, the money that's funding a lot of things in politics. There might be something similar for, academic writing. But so, for instance, like the Heritage Foundation that I talked about, that's tracking voter fraud, or a lot of organizations that sound neutral on their front are actually funded by people with specific agendas. And that is one of the problems with private funding of research a lot of times, is because those private funders, those specific people who have a lot of money, can influence exactly what's being said. So they'll hire people, think tanks, researchers, to find the results that they want, and not necessarily participate in good research tactics. So if you're ever reading an academic article, they should have a little thing that tells you about their potential sources of bias in that. I see another question here about, am I concerned about the monopoly of newspapers or news and radio stations? And yes and no. For the most part, I am not like super concerned about big newspapers at this point. I don't read a lot of newspapers personally. I'm sure that individual authors and editors and newspapers, it varies. Just like with online news sources, there's a huge, huge spectrum of print sources, even though they are getting less popular. And then on news and radio stations, once again, it's kind of an issue of, is it talking heads reporting, or is it, people who are on the ground reporting? So, if you're listening to a radio station and it's someone ranting to you for an hour about, this terrible, awful thing that happened, and they're not actually there and talking to people, and they're just telling you what they're thinking, then that's something that you should be critical of. So, yeah, it's, I guess, the most important thing that I can tell you from this week is that it's all complicated, and like, you can never take a break when it comes to encountering news. You should always, always, always have your guard up and be checking, because it's so much healthier to fact check when it's not necessary than it is to go on believing things that are, not true or harmful.
Okay. I suppose once you've kind of practiced it, you've got a number of sites that you can go to double check. It isn't necessarily a tedious, difficult process. It's just more of a habit that you have to form.
Oh yeah, it gets much easier over time as you practice recognizing it. And if you're right now looking how to improve your skills, I would absolutely recommend some of those apps and games for identifying false news or bias in media.
All right. Okay, I think you have covered just about everything, and you're probably exhausted. That's so much. Really impressive. Thank you so much. Okay, to all of you who came tonight, thank you so much. We will be posting recorded videos, so please feel free to watch again. Please feel free to share with your friends. We have one more
Please share with your
very
friends.
important. Next week we'll be learning, the class is entitled Get to Know Your Ballot, a rundown of everyone and everything on your November ballot, right? So this will be great. One stop, figure out everything, answer all the questions about this upcoming election, and we should be all good to go. We now know how important it is to actually vote, right? Because we watched your first and second classes. So, all right. Anything else?
No, I am just excited to talk to you all next week.
All right. We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.